synopsis analysis of Island Man by Grace Nichols. To understand the poem, I think first of all we have to look at Nichols' own subtitle, For a Caribbean Island Man in London Who Still Wakes Up to the Sound of the Sea. We have somebody who's been taken out of their own culture, presumably a beautiful sunny Caribbean island like that, and transplanted into somewhere completely different, somewhere completely alien to them, in this case the drab grey streets of London. The sequence of the poem starts with an idea that this character is waking up before moving on to their memories of the Caribbean island and then back to the reality of London. And I'd like just to go over how the poet demonstrates those, well, first of all, the two places, the Caribbean and London, and then the confusion between the two of them. So we will start with island life, which we see near the beginning of the poem. First quotation I'd like to look at is this: the sound of the blue surf in his head, the steady breaking and wooing. The first thing to notice there is the poet's use of sibilants, these repeated S sounds as highlighted here. And for me this represents the sound of the sea. Remember, this character Island Man still wakes up to the sound of the sea, and here we have that onomatopoeically presented throughout the poem, the repeated sibilants of the S's. And this for me implies a reality of the waves. I think perhaps you could argue it implies a fond memory, a happy memory, something like that. Another unusual word here is the word wooming, which, particularly when talking about the waves, seems a little strange, but for me it implies a sense of protection and comfort. It implies that Island Man, when he thinks of the waves, when he hears the waves in his head, feels like he's come home. He feels like he's gone back to his mother almost. The description of island life continues with wild seabirds and fishermen pushing out to sea, the sun surfacing defiantly. Island life comes across as a pretty simplistic and idyllic way of life. It seems like there's no stress, there's no strain, it's relaxed, it's laid back, and it's straightforward. And this is obviously something which Island Man remembers with fondness. Certainly this word defiant is an interesting one. It's personifying the sun. And for me the word defiant is almost daring someone to try and stop the sun come out. So the sun shines every day and there's nothing you can do to stop it, which is obviously a stark contrast to the grey reality of London, which we're about to move on to. The poem then enters a transitional phase. We'll call it confusion, a phase not quite with the memories of the island, but not yet alert to the realities of London. And it's summed up in this line: he always comes back, groggily, groggily. The first thing you've got is those two words, groggily, groggily. It's repeated for emphasis, and it's isolated on its own, separate from the rest of the poem, which is kind of where Island Man's thoughts are at the minute. He's neither in one place nor the other. He's separate, he's alone. He is isolated, particularly from his Caribbean culture. And then you have this massive gap between the word back and the first use of the word groggily, and that for me represents the gap between dream and reality, the gap between waking and sleeping, and indeed the gap between Caribbean life and London life. We then move into a more detailed description of Island Man's life in London, which is obviously a massive contrast to his Caribbean life. The first quotation I'd like to look at is this: a grey metallic saw to surge of wheels to dull north circular roar. Here you have drab colours, you have unpleasant noises. It's vastly different to the Caribbean life. Similarly, we somehow get a sense that this life is disjointed and uncomfortable. The way to surge of wheels is separated out with a large gap. It almost implies it implies Island Man is ill at ease, he's not comfortable, it's not a place he wants to be in particularly. And then we have this rhyme between saw and roar, which for me exaggerates the noise. It seems interminable, it seems like it will never stop. Moving on to the end of the poem, we have the words muffling, muffling, his crumpling pillow waves, Island Man heaves himself, another London day. There's a few points I'd like to pick up about the ending. First of all, you have this repetition of muffling. It emphasises the numbness of his senses, how bored he is. Secondly, you have this metaphor, his crumpled pillow waves, which for me, the word waves, we've talked about waves already and the sounds of them. His crumpling pillow waves reminds the memory is still present. It's present in his physical reality, which partly implies his confusion, but also the strength of the memory of his original culture. Moving towards the end now, that word heaves. He heaves himself out of bed, which implies he's unwilling. He's not leaping out of bed. This isn't somewhere he wants to be. Life is hard. Life is a drain. It's a bore. It's not a pleasure. There's no wild seabirds and fishermen pushing out to sea. Even though they would be heaving the boats, they seem to be doing it quite willingly, yet even getting out of bed It's unpleasant for Island Man. And then that final line, another London day, makes his life seem routine, mundane, repetitive, interminable boredom, and there's no way out of it. It repeats itself over and over again in stark contrast to his Caribbean lifestyle. So the question we're left with is this all negative? Can we find some happiness, some hope in the poem? And again, I will draw back to Nichols' subtitle. That word still wakes up to the sound of the sea. The still is going to be so important here. We've already talked about the sibilance throughout, so the waves are crashing throughout the poem, bringing home that memory of Island Man's island life. But there's another thing in this poem as well that reminds us of waves. So if we have a look at the shape of the poem, we can almost see those Caribbean waves breaking throughout the poem, the way the line lengths dip in and out, representing the waves. So again, I think we have a sense that Island Man's life in the Caribbean will not and has not been forgotten. And this for me gives us a sense of hope. It gives us a sense of the strength of his original culture, the strength he can take from that culture in a life in which he's not perfectly happy. And that's obviously a concept which we can then take on and compare with the other poems. Thank you for watching, and please do keep checking back to see if there are any further videos.